The loudest laugh in the room came from my sister 5 minutes before she learned how wrong she was. That is the moment most people would probably remember. But for me, the story started long before that dinner. It started 10 years earlier with a folding table, a used laptop, and a business idea that almost nobody believed in. My name is Olivia Bennett, and for most of my adult life, my family treated my company like a hobby that had somehow gotten out of control. At first, I understood their skepticism. I was 27 years old when I left a stable marketing job to start a small branding and digital design agency. I had no investors, no fancy office, and no safety net beyond a modest savings account that disappeared faster than I expected. I worked from a spare bedroom in my apartment, answered customer emails at midnight, and spent weekends trying to convince local businesses to take a chance on me. Those early years were difficult, but they were also exciting. Every new client felt like a victory. Every contract felt like proof that I was building something real. Unfortunately, not everyone saw it that way. My older sister Lauren certainly did not. Lauren had always been the successful one in the family. She had a prestigious corporate job, a beautiful house in an upscale neighborhood, and a talent for making every room pay attention when she spoke. People admired her confidence. Sometimes I did too. But confidence and kindness are not always the same thing. Whenever my business came up during family gatherings, Lauren somehow found a way to turn it into a joke. "How is the little project going?" she would ask with a smile that never felt friendly. Or, "Did you finally become a real company yet?" Everyone would laugh, awkwardly. I usually laughed too, because it felt easier than explaining why the comments bothered me. At first, I thought she would eventually stop. Once the business survived a year, surely she would stop. Then 2 years passed. Then 5. Then 8. She never stopped. The strange part was that the company actually did well. Not overnight. Not dramatically. But steadily. Each year was stronger than the one before. We added clients. We hired employees. We expanded services. Quietly, without attracting much attention, the business grew into something much larger than the tiny operation my family still imagined. Yet I rarely discussed numbers with them. Every time I tried, the conversation changed direction. My parents would ask Lauren about her latest promotion. My father would ask about her husband's new investment property. Someone would compliment their latest vacation photos. Meanwhile, my updates were often met with polite nods and quick subject changes. Eventually, I stopped sharing details. Not because I was embarrassed. Because I was tired. Tired of defending something that consumed most of my waking hours. Tired of explaining achievements that nobody seemed interested in understanding. So I learned to keep my success quiet. By the 10th year, my company occupied an entire floor of a downtown office building. We employed more than 30 people. We worked with clients across multiple states. I was proud of what we had built, not because of the revenue, because of the people, because families depended on the jobs we created, because customers trusted us, because every piece of growth had been earned through persistence rather than luck. Yet somehow, in my family's eyes, I remained the younger sister with a little business. The funny thing about being underestimated is that eventually you stop trying to change people's minds. You simply keep working. And that is exactly what I did. Which is why, when my parents invited everyone to a family dinner that spring, I arrived expecting the same familiar pattern. I had no idea that before the evening ended, Lauren would make one final joke about my company, and I would finally have a reason to answer. If Lauren's comments had only happened once or twice, I probably would have forgotten them years ago. The problem was never a single joke. The problem was the pattern. Looking back, I can trace it through nearly every major milestone of my career. When I landed my first large client, Lauren asked whether they were paying enough to cover my rent. When I hired my first employee, She joked that I was finally becoming a real boss. When the company moved into its first office, she wondered out loud how long I would be able to afford it. None of the comments sounded openly cruel when taken individually. That was what made them so difficult to challenge. Every remark arrived wrapped inside a smile. Every insult came disguised as humor. If I reacted, I looked overly sensitive. If I stayed quiet, the behavior continued. Eventually, I chose silence. The family did too. My parents rarely joined in, but they rarely stopped it either. My father would laugh awkwardly and change the subject. My mother would say something like, "Lauren is just teasing." Then the conversation would move on. Over time, I realized something uncomfortable. People often accept the version of you that was created years ago, even after you have completely changed. In their minds, I was still the younger sister taking a risky chance on an uncertain business. They never updated the story. Meanwhile, real life kept moving forward. By the 9th year, our company was handling national accounts. We had built long-term partnerships with major clients. Revenue was stronger than ever. We had a talented leadership team, stable operations, and a reputation that I had spent a decade earning. Yet none of that seemed to matter at family gatherings. The more successful the company became, the less interested I felt in discussing it. Success became something I celebrated with my employees instead. They understood what it had cost. They remembered the late nights, the difficult decisions, and the risks. They had lived through the journey. My family had only watched from a distance. About 6 months before the dinner at my parents' house, something unexpected happened. I received an email from a private equity group that specialized in acquiring growing companies. At first, I ignored it. Similar inquiries had arrived before. Most went nowhere. This one felt different. The people involved had done their homework. They understood our industry. They understood our growth. More importantly, they understood our potential. What started as a simple conversation gradually evolved into a series of meetings. Then more meetings. Then formal discussions. I told almost nobody outside the company. Not because it was a secret. Because nothing was guaranteed. Deals fall apart all the time. I refused to celebrate something that might never happen. Months passed. The conversations became increasingly serious. Financial reviews were completed. Legal teams became involved. Every week brought another step forward. Through all of it, I maintained my normal routine. I attended meetings, reviewed projects, supported clients, and every few weeks, I attended another family gathering where Lauren continued treating my company like a punchline. The contrast became almost surreal. During the day, experienced investors discussed the long-term value of the business. Then a few days later, my sister would ask whether I had considered getting a real career. By the time spring arrived, negotiations had entered their final stage. I still had not told my family. Part of me wanted to. Part of me imagined the surprise on their faces. But another part of me knew exactly what would happen. Lauren would find a way to dismiss it. She always did. So I said nothing. Then my mother announced she was hosting a family dinner to celebrate my parents' wedding anniversary. Everyone would be there. Lauren, her husband, my parents, a few relatives, and me. At the time, I thought it would be another ordinary evening. I could not have been more wrong. Because while I was driving to that dinner, the final paperwork was already waiting for my signature. And sitting in my purse was information that would completely change the direction of the night. My parents' house looked exactly the same as it always had. The white siding, the carefully maintained flower beds, the familiar front porch where countless family photos had been taken over the years. As I pulled into the driveway that evening, I remember sitting in my car for a few extra seconds before getting out. Not because I was nervous, because I was exhausted. The previous 3 months had been some of the busiest of my professional life. Between negotiations, legal reviews, financial audits, and the day-to-day responsibilities of running the company, I had barely stopped moving. Yet strangely, I felt calm. The uncertainty that had surrounded the potential sale was finally disappearing. Within days, maybe even hours, everything would be finalized. For the first time in years, I could see the finish line. Inside the house, the anniversary celebration was already underway. Relatives filled the dining room. My mother moved between guests, carrying trays of food, while my father proudly greeted everyone who arrived. The atmosphere felt warm and familiar. Lauren was already there, sitting at the center of a conversation as usual. Some things never changed. "Olivia," my mother called as soon as she saw me. She wrapped me in a quick hug before immediately asking about work. "Busy," I answered with a smile. "Very busy. That sounds like a good thing." "It is." Before she could ask another question, someone called her name from across the room, and she hurried away. I laughed quietly. My mother had always been able to manage 5 conversations at the same time. For the next hour, the evening unfolded normally. People talked about vacations, school events, retirement plans, home renovations, and local news. I listened more than I spoke, partly because I was tired, partly because I had learned long ago that family gatherings were rarely the place to discuss business. Still, a few relatives asked polite questions. "How is work going?" an uncle asked. "Very well," I replied. "The company is having a strong year." He nodded approvingly before the conversation drifted toward another topic. That simple exchange lasted less than 30 seconds. Meanwhile, Lauren spent nearly 10 minutes describing a recent corporate conference she attended in Chicago. Everyone listened attentively. Again, some things never changed. The real turning point came during dinner. We had just finished the main course when my father raised his glass to thank everyone for coming. A few toasts followed. Laughter filled the room. For a while, everything felt pleasant. Then one of my cousins asked a completely innocent question. "Olivia, how long have you owned your company now?" "Just over 10 years, I answered. 10 years, another relative said. "That is impressive." Before I could respond, Lauren smiled. It was a smile I knew well, the kind that usually meant trouble was coming. 10 years, she repeated. "That is actually incredible." Several people looked toward her. "Why?" someone asked. Lauren took a sip of wine. "Because most people would have given up by now." A few uncomfortable laughs appeared around the table. My stomach sank immediately. Not because the comment hurt, because it felt so predictable. 10 years later, and we were still having the same conversation. I smiled politely and said nothing. Lauren continued. "I mean, seriously, you have to admire persistence." More laughter followed. My father shifted slightly in his chair. My mother looked down at her plate. Nobody challenged the comment. Nobody ever did. The strange thing was that I no longer felt embarrassed. A decade earlier, remarks like that would have ruined my evening. Now they simply felt outdated. Lauren was still talking about a version of my life that no longer existed. The only person at the table who seemed unaware of that fact was Lauren herself. I glanced briefly at the folder inside, my purse resting beside my chair. Final transaction summaries. Valuation reports. Signed documents. Information that would completely change the conversation if I chose to share it. But I stayed quiet, at least for the moment, because Lauren was not finished speaking yet. And within the next few minutes, she was about to say the one thing that would make silence impossible. Lauren leaned back in her chair, clearly pleased with the reaction she had received. The laughter around the table was fading, but the attention remained exactly where she wanted it. On her. I had seen this pattern countless times before. She would make a joke at my expense, people would laugh awkwardly, and then everyone would move on. Normally, that was where the story ended. This time was different. You have to admit, Lauren continued, smiling at several relatives around the table, most people would have figured out by now whether a business was actually going somewhere. My cousin shifted uncomfortably. My mother took a sip of water and stared at the tablecloth. My father cleared his throat but said nothing. The familiar silence settled over the room again. It was the same silence that had protected comments like these for years. I looked at Lauren and realized something surprising. I was not angry, not even a little. If anything, I felt detached, almost amused, because for the first time in a decade I knew something she did not. Actually, I said calmly, the company is doing very well. Lauren smiled. Sure it is. A few people laughed politely. She shrugged. Hey, if you are happy, that is what matters. The words sounded supportive on the surface, but everyone at the table understood what she meant. It was the verbal equivalent of patting someone on the head. I noticed my uncle looking toward me with genuine curiosity. How many employees do you have now? He asked. 32. The room became slightly quieter. 32, he repeated. I did not realize it was that large. It has grown quite a bit, I answered. Before anyone could continue the conversation, Lauren jumped back in. That is what Olivia does, she said with a laugh. She always makes it sound bigger than it is. This time, nobody laughed immediately. Several relatives exchanged glances. I could feel the shift beginning. Very small, very subtle, but it was there. People were starting to notice the difference between curiosity and criticism, between asking questions and dismissing answers. Lauren either did not notice or did not care. So tell me, she continued, what exactly is the long-term plan? Keep running this little agency forever. There it was again. Little agency. After 10 years, 32 employees, national clients, and more work than I could comfortably manage, it was still a little agency. I almost smiled. Actually, I said, things are changing. Lauren raised an eyebrow. Oh, yes. That was all I offered. Not because I wanted to be mysterious. Because I genuinely did not feel the need to explain myself anymore. For years, I had chased validation from people who had already decided what they believed. No presentation, spreadsheet, or success story was going to change their minds. At least not until they were ready. Dinner continued for another 20 minutes. Conversations drifted from topic to topic. My parents opened anniversary gifts. People shared stories and family memories. Gradually, I relaxed again. Then, dessert arrived. And with it came the moment that changed everything. My father had just finished thanking everyone for attending when Lauren turned toward me once more. You know, she said casually, I have always admired your optimism. I immediately recognized the tone. Trouble was coming. Really? I asked. Absolutely. She smiled. I could never spend 10 years pouring energy into something that probably is not worth very much. The room froze. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Just enough. Several people stopped moving. My cousin looked down at his plate. My mother closed her eyes briefly. Even my father looked uncomfortable. Lauren laughed softly. Come on. We are family. We can be honest. Then she delivered the sentence that finally ended 10 years of silence. I mean, what is it really worth? For a moment, nobody spoke. The question hung in the air between us. I slowly placed my fork on my plate. Then I looked directly at my sister. And for the first time in 10 years, I decided to answer. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Lauren's question remained suspended over the table while every pair of eyes shifted toward me. I could see the confidence on her face. She expected me to dodge the question. She expected an uncomfortable laugh or a vague answer. After all, that was how these conversations had always ended. She made a joke. I stayed polite. Everyone moved on. But something had changed. Not in the room. In me. 10 years of defending myself had quietly disappeared somewhere along the way. I no longer felt the need to convince anyone of anything. I folded my hands calmly and looked directly at my sister. "That is actually an interesting question," I said. Lauren smiled. "I thought so." A few nervous chuckles drifted around the table. My father shifted in his chair. My mother stared at me with a look that suggested she sensed something important was about to happen. "The truth is," I continued, "I spent most of the last few months trying to figure out the answer myself." Lauren's smile faded slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means investors were asking the same question." The room immediately became quieter. My cousin lowered his fork. My uncle looked up. Even Lauren appeared briefly confused. "Investors?" she asked. "Yes." I kept my voice calm. "A private equity group approached us several months ago." My father blinked. "Approached you for what?" "To discuss acquiring the company." Complete silence followed. Not the uncomfortable silence that usually appeared after one of Lauren's jokes. This was different. People were listening now. Actually listening. Lauren laughed softly. "Well, that sounds impressive." The confidence had returned to her voice, but I noticed something new beneath it. Uncertainty. "It was," I said. "The process took longer than I expected." "Did anything come of it?" she asked. There it was. The question she thought would expose me. The question she believed had an obvious answer. I glanced briefly at the folder beside my chair. Then I looked back at her. "Yes." The single word changed the atmosphere instantly. My mother sat up straighter. My father stopped eating entirely. Lauren's expression became more focused. "What do you mean, yes?" she asked. "The transaction was finalized this week." Nobody spoke. The room felt frozen. Lauren stared at me for several seconds before responding. "Wait. You sold the company." "Most of it," I said. "I retained a minority ownership position and joined the new leadership structure." My uncle's eyes widened. "You are serious?" "Very." Questions immediately began appearing from multiple directions. When did this happen? How long had negotiations been taking place? Why had I never mentioned it? I answered politely, keeping my responses brief. Then Lauren asked the one question everyone else seemed reluctant to say out loud. "So, what was the valuation?" The room became silent again. This time, the silence felt heavier, more intentional. For years, my sister had measured success by titles, neighborhoods, and public recognition. She had spent a decade assuming she understood exactly where I stood. Now she was waiting for a number that would either confirm everything she believed or destroy it. I took a slow breath, not because I was nervous, because I wanted to choose my words carefully. The final transaction valued the company at $38 million. Nobody reacted immediately. The number seemed to hang in the air for several seconds before anyone processed it. My mother was the first to speak. "$38 million?" she whispered. I nodded. My father looked genuinely stunned. My cousin nearly dropped his glass. Across the table, Lauren simply stared at me. The confidence that had carried her through the evening was gone. Completely gone. For the first time in 10 years, she had nothing to say. And the strangest part was that I felt no satisfaction. No triumph. No desire to embarrass her. I only felt relief. Relief that I no longer had to sit quietly while someone else defined my story. The silence after that number was unlike anything I had ever experienced in that house. For years, I had imagined what it might feel like if my family finally understood what I had built. I assumed there would be excitement. Pride. maybe even celebration. Instead, the room seemed caught between disbelief and confusion. Everyone was trying to reconcile two completely different versions of me. The Olivia they thought they knew, and the Olivia sitting in front of them. My father was the first to recover. $38 million? He repeated. That is the valuation? Yes, I answered. The transaction closed earlier this week. He leaned back in his chair and shook his head slowly. Why did you never tell us? It was a fair question, one I had asked myself many times over the years. Because nobody seemed interested, I said honestly. Nobody argued with that. My mother looked down at her hands. My uncle suddenly had a dozen questions about the company. My cousin wanted to know how large the client base had become. Relatives who had barely discussed my work for years now seemed fascinated by every detail. The shift was impossible to miss. Yet the person I noticed most was Lauren. She remained unusually quiet. Not angry, not defensive, just quiet. It was a side of her I rarely saw. Eventually, she forced a small laugh. Well, that is certainly bigger than I thought. The sentence sounded harmless, but it carried something unfamiliar. Humility. Not much. Just enough to notice. Most people did not know, I said. The company was never really something I talked about. Lauren looked at me carefully. You mean you stopped talking about it? I met her eyes. Yes. For the first time all evening, she did not have a comeback ready. The conversation gradually moved on, but the atmosphere never fully returned to normal. Everyone seemed distracted by the revelation. My father kept asking follow-up questions. My mother looked emotional. Even relatives who normally avoided business discussions wanted details. I answered politely, but something strange was happening inside me. The validation I had imagined for years felt far less satisfying than expected. Maybe because it had arrived too late. Maybe because success had already taught me what I needed to know. A few years earlier, this moment would have meant everything. Now it felt like confirmation of something I had already accepted. Their opinions had never determined my value. After dessert, people slowly drifted into smaller conversations throughout the house. I stepped outside onto the back patio for a few minutes to enjoy the evening air. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. For the first time all day, I felt completely relaxed. Then I heard the sliding door open behind me. Lauren stepped outside. We stood in silence for several seconds. Congratulations, she finally said. I turned toward her. Thank you. Another pause followed. I honestly did not know. There was no sarcasm in her voice. No hidden yav. Just honesty. I know. She folded her arms and looked across the backyard. I thought I did. Thought you did what? Thought I knew exactly how your life was going. I nodded slowly. A lot of people did. She laughed softly, though there was little humor in it. You know what is embarrassing? She asked. What? I spent years acting like I understood your business. The truth is I never really tried. The words surprised me, not because they were dramatic, because they were genuine. For years, every conversation between us had been a competition that only one of us knew we were playing. Now, standing there beneath the evening sky, that competition suddenly felt exhausted. Lauren looked at me again. I owe you an apology. The sentence landed quietly between us. And for the first time in a very long time, I believed she actually meant it. Lauren and I remained on the patio long after the noise from inside the house faded into the background. The evening air was cool, and for the first time in years, neither of us seemed interested in winning an argument. She leaned against the railing and looked out across the backyard where we had played as children. I have been thinking about this for a while, she said quietly. Not the sale. Everything. I waited. I do not think I realized how often I made those comments. I almost smiled. You made them pretty often. She nodded. I know that now. The honesty surprised me more than the apology itself. Most people defend their behavior before they acknowledge it. Lauren seemed exhausted by the effort of pretending. Can I ask you something? She said. Of course. Why did you never tell me to stop? The question caught me off guard. For a moment, I considered giving the easy answer. Then I decided against it, because I thought eventually you would stop on your own. Lauren looked down at the ground. And when I did not, then I convinced myself it did not matter. We both knew that was only partly true. The comments had mattered. Maybe not because they damaged my confidence, but because they revealed something deeper. They revealed how little interest she had shown in understanding what I was actually building. Lauren sighed heavily. The truth is ugly. What truth? She hesitated. I was jealous. The answer arrived so directly that it left no room for misunderstanding. Jealous? I repeated. Of what? She laughed softly. That is the ridiculous part. I am not even sure anymore. She paused. You took a risk I never would have taken. I listened quietly. When you started your company, I thought it would fail. Not because I wanted it to fail, because that seemed logical. Most businesses do fail. She looked toward me. Then, every year it survived. Every year it grew. And instead of admitting I was wrong, I kept treating it like a temporary phase. The explanation made more sense than I wanted it to. People often become attached to old assumptions. Admitting someone has surpassed your expectations sometimes requires admitting you misjudged them from the beginning. I think part of me needed to believe I was making better choices, she continued. You had the uncertain path. I had the safe path. That story felt comfortable. Until it stopped being true? I asked gently. Lauren nodded. Until it stopped being true. We stood in silence again. Inside the house, I could hear laughter from relatives who were probably still discussing the sale. Strangely, that conversation no longer interested me. The number was never the important part. The important part was understanding what had happened between us. You know, Lauren said, when everyone reacted to the valuation tonight, I realized something. What? Nobody was surprised that you succeeded. I looked at her curiously. What do you mean? They were surprised by how much. She shook her head. But nobody acted shocked that you built something valuable. Deep down, everyone already knew you were capable of it. The observation lingered in my mind. Maybe she was right. Maybe the problem had never been my ability. Maybe it had been the story people told themselves about me. And maybe I had allowed that story to exist longer than necessary. Before we went back inside, Lauren looked at me one more time. I cannot change the last 10 years. No, I said. You cannot. But I would like to do better moving forward. For the first time that evening, I smiled without reservation. Not because everything was fixed. Not because trust magically returned. But because real change always begins with accountability. And for the first time in a very long time, accountability had finally entered the conversation. Over the next few weeks, life settled into a rhythm that felt surprisingly normal. The transaction was completed, the leadership transition moved forward smoothly, and for the first time in more than a decade, I found myself with something unfamiliar. Space. Not free time exactly. I was still involved with the company and still responsible for important decisions. But the constant pressure of carrying every major responsibility alone had finally eased. What surprised me most was not the business side of the transition. It was the change within my family. The dinner at my parents' house had become impossible to ignore. The conversations that followed were different from anything we had experienced before. My father called me several days later and asked if we could have lunch together. During that lunch, he admitted something I never expected to hear. I should have paid more attention, he said quietly. To what? I asked. To what you were building. To how people talk to you. He looked genuinely disappointed in himself. I always assumed the two of you would work things out. I understood what he meant. For years, my parents had treated the tension between Lauren and me as harmless sibling dynamics. They never saw how repetition could slowly become disrespect. I am not angry, I told him. I know. He nodded. But I still should have done better. Similar conversations followed with my mother. She admitted she often noticed Lauren's comments, but convinced herself they were harmless because nobody openly argued. That realization seemed difficult for her. Like many people, she had mistaken the absence of conflict for the presence of peace. They are not the same thing. Meanwhile, Lauren surprised me more than anyone. Her apology on the patio had not been a temporary emotional reaction. She followed it with actions. Small actions. Consistent actions. She called occasionally just to ask how I was doing. Not how the company was doing. Not how the sale was going. How I was doing. At first, the conversations felt awkward. Years of assumptions do not disappear overnight. But gradually something shifted. For the first time in our adult lives, we began speaking to each other as equals rather than competitors. One afternoon, about a month after the family dinner, Lauren invited me to meet her for coffee. As we sat together near the window of a local cafe, she laughed and shook her head. "Do you know what the worst part is?" she asked. "What?" "The more I learn about what you built, the more impressed I become." I smiled. "That sounds like a compliment." "It is." She laughed again. "An overdue one." Then she said something that stayed with me. "I think I spent years measuring success by visibility." I looked at her curiously. "What do you mean?" "Titles. Promotions. Recognition. Things people can easily see." She stirred her coffee thoughtfully. "Your success was different. Most of it happened quietly." The observation felt accurate. There had never been a dramatic moment when the company suddenly became successful. Growth had arrived through thousands of small decisions spread across 10 years. The world rarely notices that kind of progress. Sometimes families do not notice it either. As our conversation continued, I realized the biggest change had not happened in Lauren. It had happened in me. For years, I wanted her respect. I wanted my family to see me differently. I believed their recognition would somehow validate everything I had accomplished. But sitting there across from my sister, I finally understood something important. The sale had not changed my value. The valuation had not changed my value. Their opinions had not changed my value. The only thing that had changed was their awareness. I had been the same person the day before the dinner as I was afterward. The same work, the same effort, the same accomplishments. The difference was that now everyone could see them. And for the first time, I realized I no longer needed that recognition nearly as much as I once thought I did. About a year after that anniversary dinner, I found myself back at my parents' house for another family gathering. The setting looked familiar. The same dining room, the same photographs on the walls, the same voices filling the house. Yet everything felt different. Not because of the company, not because of the sale, because the relationships inside those walls had changed. Lauren arrived early and helped my mother prepare food in the kitchen. My father greeted guests while joking about retirement plans. Relatives moved comfortably through the house, sharing stories and laughter. For the first time in many years, I did not feel like I was walking into a room where I needed to prove anything. I was simply family. At one point during the evening, my uncle asked how things were going with the business. Before I could answer, Lauren smiled and said, "You should hear what Olivia is working on now. It is impressive." The comment lasted only a few seconds, but it meant more than she probably realized. Not because I needed the compliment, because it reflected genuine respect rather than comparison. That was something we had never really shared before. Later that evening, I stepped outside onto the same patio where Lauren had apologized the year before. The backyard looked exactly as it had then. The trees swayed gently in the evening breeze. The sky slowly darkened as the sun disappeared below the horizon. Standing there alone, I found myself thinking about the version of me who had arrived at that anniversary dinner 12 months earlier. She was successful by almost every external measure, yet she still carried an invisible burden. She wanted acknowledgement. She wanted understanding. She wanted people she loved to recognize what she had accomplished. None of those desires were unreasonable, but somewhere along the way, I had allowed other people's opinions to become more important than my own understanding of who I was. The biggest lesson from the entire experience had nothing to do with money. The valuation made headlines inside my family because numbers are easy to understand. People can measure them, compare them, react to them. But the real transformation happened internally. For years, I believed success would finally earn me validation. Instead, success taught me that validation was never the prize. Peace was. The peace that comes from knowing your worth before anyone else recognizes it. The peace that comes from continuing forward even when people misunderstand you. The peace that comes from building something meaningful whether or not others appreciate it. A few minutes later, Lauren stepped onto the patio carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. She handed one to me and smiled. "You always end up out here." "It is quiet," I said. "That is true." We stood together looking across the yard. Eventually she laughed softly. "You know, I still think about that night sometimes." "Me too. Mostly because I cannot believe how wrong I was." I smiled. "You were not the only one." She looked surprised. "What do you mean?" "I spent years thinking I needed your approval." Lauren stared at me for a moment before shaking her head. "That sounds exhausting." It was. We both laughed. Then the silence returned. Comfortable this time. The kind that exists between people who no longer need to defend themselves. Looking back now, I do not remember the exact expression on Lauren's face when I revealed the valuation. I do not remember every question that followed or every reaction around the table. What I remember is the moment afterward. The moment I realized that my value had never depended on anyone else's opinion. Not my sister's. Not my parents'. Not society's. The company was simply evidence of something I should have understood years earlier. The people who underestimate you are often working from an outdated version of your story. You do not need to fight them. You do not need to convince them. You simply keep building. And eventually, whether they understand it or not, the truth speaks for itself.